All right, hey everybody, good evening.
Good evening.
Good to see you all tonight, and welcome to the Calvary Talk 2024, and looking forward to this evening. I think most of us here probably know Pastor Todd, but there might be a few that don't, right? So let me just give his creds why he's here tonight. But Todd was the pastor here from 2000, tell me out here, Todd. 2008, 2018. And I came shortly after, so we worked together through many of those years and developed a good, warm friendship. Also co-founded the CPT together, so if you're aware of the CPT, that's starting up tomorrow. And Todd is up here for that as well and helps to provide leadership there and is on the board there. Todd is now currently, listen to this is a fancy title, Special Advisor to the President of Southern Wesleyan. So, you know, that sounds important. And he also, though maybe more significantly, is the founder and works integrated leadership. Got that right? And does a lot of coaching with pastors and other leaders. So that's what he's up to nowadays. But if you don't know Todd, is a graduate of Wheaton College, a graduate of Cambridge, and did an MBA since he left Calvary here at Kellogg, and has spent a lot of time thinking about leadership and thinking about politics, and has a love for C.S. Lewis, as I think probably many of us do here. And so I'm excited and interested to hear what C.S. Lewis thinks about politics. I did see one of the slides that said, who would C.S. Lewis vote for? And I had a picture of Harris and Trump, so we're going to find out tonight about that answer, so I don't want to give too much away now. But anyway, let's welcome the Reverend Dr. Todd Wilson. Hey, and I'll say one last thing. What we're going to do, Todd's going to give a presentation, probably about 45, 50 minutes, and then he and I are going to sit down. I'll have a few questions to kind of kick us off, and then we've got the microphones down front. So if you've got a question, just kind of be marking it, and then we'll take some time for Q&A at the end. So
that's great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gerald. Well, good evening.
Good evening.
So good to see all of you. So many familiar faces. Delighted to be back in Oak Park and at Calvary. And thank you, Gerald and Calvary, for inviting me back to do this presentation on two of, as Gerald said, two of my loves, politics and C.S. Lewis. I should probably confess at the front end, I am not a scholar in either topic. I have a New Testament background, but I have had a long-standing passion. I'm a graduate of Wheaton College, and they literally have the wardrobe, Lewis's wardrobe, at Wheaton College. So everybody out at Wheaton College loves C.S. Lewis, so I've had a long-standing love for C.S. Lewis and a passion for culture, society, theology, the church, ministry, and all of which has relevance for politics. And so I've had a passion for politics as well. And so these two passions of mine have come together over the last year and a half, and it's kind of like if you're a Kansas City Chiefs fans and a Swiftie. Are some of you tracking with this? And Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce get together? Did I just make that joke right? And that's kind of embarrassing. That was embarrassing. So delighted to share this evening on the theme, Medicine, Not Food, C.S. Lewis on the purpose and the perils of democracy. And Gerald did steal a little of my thunder by revealing what is the question I suspect is on everybody's mind, which is, what would C.S. Lewis think about the current election? Who would C.S. Lewis vote for? The big elephant, or perhaps the elephants in the room, right? Who would C.S. Lewis vote for? We have a Q&A. You could ask me what I think about how he would answer that. But Lewis was asked, actually, a question similar to that about where he aligned politically back in the day. And this is what he said in response. He said, I doubt if I'm a Tory, that's the Conservative Party in Britain. He said, I doubt if I'm a Tory, I am much more nearly a political skeptic. Some of you step into this space tonight, and you might be struggling with political skepticism. Well, you are in good company with C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis was famous amongst his friends and those who knew him for despising partisan politics. It made him totally crazy. He felt like it was all ephemeral and not substantive. And Lewis was passionate about finding and seeing the permanent in the political. Not the ephemeral, but the substantive. That which is solid, the deep truths that politics often points to. But Lewis was famous for despising partisan politics, perhaps like some of you in the room tonight. And so again, you're in good company. Lewis was also famous for never reading the newspaper, really. In fact, he said to his dear friend and biographer, Walter Hooper, at one point, he asked Walter Hooper at one point, "Who's Elizabeth Taylor?" He didn't know who Elizabeth Taylor was. To which Walter Hooper responded, "We just need to read the newspapers, Lewis." And Lewis was disgusted at the thought of reading a paper and said to Walter Hooper, his friend, "Walter, if you, in a point of weakness, have to succumb to reading the newspaper, you must use the Lord of the Rings as mouthwash to rinse yourself off." But I think Lewis might say something like this if we were to ask him, who would you vote for in this election? That is to say, if we tried to corner the Oxbridge Don and have him pony up some political sort of power in our position, or, he might say something like this: don't look for a political ally in me, and don't look for a political ally in Christianity. This is what Lewis says in Mere Christianity. And I think this is such a good word for perhaps all of us in the room tonight. Most of us are not really approaching the subject of politics in order to find out what Christianity says. We're approaching it in the hope of finding support from Christianity for the views of our own party. We're looking for an ally when we are offered in Christianity either a master or a judge. I think that's a great word for perhaps all of us in the room tonight. Not just about Lewis, of course. Wouldn't it be lovely to have Lewis in our back pocket supporting all of our political views? All the more so to have Christianity in our back pocket supporting all of our political views. But Christianity doesn't offer itself to us in that way, but comes rather as a master and as a judge, as a system of faith, a framework of belief that we need to submit to, rather than to try to put in our back pocket. And so perhaps we can, in the Q&A, come back to the question of who might Lewis vote for. But I thought we might start here instead. And I'll ask you what is often asked of older folks. Some of you in the room were alive for Kennedy's assassination, and the question is often asked, where were you when? Do you remember where you were when? And so I want to ask you, where were you when? That beautiful September morning in 2001, when the second plane crashed into the World Trade Center tower, and we knew now it was not an accident, but an attack. I was out in Wheaton. I was a graduate student at Wheaton College, and I was in the Buswell Memorial Library. It was like 9 o'clock in the morning, and Katie was home with our firstborn son, Ezra, and when she would be doing the morning routine of feeding, et cetera, she would have Good Morning America on when Katie Couric and Matt Lauer were still doing Good Morning America. And I called her just to touch base. Maybe I heard something. I can't remember, but I called her, and I remember a panic in her voice. "Todd, a second plane crashed into the building. Get to a TV." And I remember the wake-up call. I'm sure all of us do. The wake-up call that was to all of us in America, that, wow, not everybody in the world loves the United States. Because when you live in the United States, it's very easy and very tempting to feel like we're pretty awesome. And what's there not to love about us? And that was such a startling wake-up call. Where were you when? Do you remember where you were on September 11, 2001? Or where were you when the riot on the Capitol happened in January 6, 2021? I was at home working from my home office, and I came down for lunch, and I think I had picked up in my news feed that something was happening, something was going down. I knew a lot of build-up to that day, but I didn't realize that a riot was happening, something that looked really scary on television. So I got my sandwich, I sat in front of the television, I turned it on to see what was happening, and it was scary. And I remember sitting there, I can't remember when I turned it on, maybe 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I can't remember exactly the timing. And I sat there for another 10 hours. And I riveted. Do you remember where you were on January 6, 2021? And another kind of wake-up call, wasn't it? It was a wake-up call like, not all is well with American democracy. No matter what you think about the politics or who's to blame or what was in play or what was at work on January 6th, that's not my point. The kind of partisan dynamic there. That's not my point. Regardless of where you are on that issue, surely we all can agree that that was a powerful wake-up call, that not all is well with American democracy. And it has had all of us grappling, hasn't it? And wrestling with the problems we are facing in our democracy. Lots of pundits, lots of podcasters, lots of politicians and bloviators of all types and stripes and scholars and people thinking about the challenge that we face in America and the problems with democracy. The pictures on the screen are not from January 6th, they are from the Charlottesville riot several years earlier, which I think was a little harbinger of harder things to come. That not all is well in American democracy. We are struggling. I don't want to be apocalyptic, but there is deep struggle in the country and challenges. The question, of course, that we're all wrestling with, I think, as a society is what's wrong with American democracy? What's gone wrong? What's the problem? Who's to blame? Where do we point the finger? Like, what's the problem? And again, there are lots of answers on offer, and lots of books, lots of thoughtful folks talking about this. And having read quite a bit of this over the last number of years, I would boil it all down, and then listening to conversations and listening to the chatter in the news media, etc., I would boil it down to two basic answers to the question, what is wrong with American democracy? And answer number one is the problem with American democracy. That is something, a policy, a structure in our government, an issue, open borders, Second Amendment issues, Roe v. Wade, the Electoral College, a radicalized Supreme Court, you name it, it's being talked about as the problem with American democracy. The second answer that people often offer is them. They're the problem. Some subset of the American population that if we could just change them or remove them from the scene or do something with them or do something to them, we would solve the problem with American democracy. It's MAGA voters, no, it's liberal elites. It's billionaires, no, it's non-college educated rural folks that live in the South. It's trans rights advocates, no, it's those that are pro-life. It's them. Some subset of the American population that is really not fully American, really not aligning with the values and the direction and the purpose and identity of the country. It and them. And I wonder if you identify with either of those answers, if either of those have been in your mind as you think about the problems with American democracy. Now, C.S. Lewis would have a different take on the problem with democracy and the problem with American democracy. That's not a picture of C.S. Lewis. That's a picture of someone that C.S. Lewis greatly admired and loved his writings. That is G.K. Chesterton. And G.K. Chesterton, a little bit older than Lewis, but similarly a committed Catholic Christian, Lewis an Anglican, but Chesterton a Catholic Christian, and a writer and a pundit and a brilliant, brilliant individual. He was once asked to write an article for a news magazine, a famous periodical in Britain, and this was the prompt: what is wrong with the world? To which Chesterton gave this as his response: I am yours truly, G.K. Chesterton. C.S. Lewis would say something similar about the problems with democracy. Lewis would say it's not it. It's not the Electoral College that is making an imbalance in the popular vote in the presidential. It's not a policy issue or a structural issue. It's none of those things. And it's not them. Rather, I think Lewis would say, it's us. It's us. We are the problem and the challenge with democracy. For my money, the most powerful thing Lewis said in his writings, and I haven't read everything Lewis has read, but I've read a lot of it. And in my opinion, the most powerful thing he says comes at the beginning of his 1943 essay entitled Equality, the opening sentence of that essay, where this is the most powerful thing I think he says about politics, and he says this: I am a Democrat, that is, I believe in democracy because I believe in the fall of man. I believe in democracy because I believe in human sinfulness. I have a view of human nature, a Christian view of human nature, that causes me to be a supporter of and an advocate for democracy. That's what Lewis is saying, highlighting just how important it is to have a right understanding of human nature as the starting point for thinking about government and politics and democracy. So I take this to be perhaps his most important sentence on politics in all of his writings. But I think the second most important sentence he wrote is the sentence that comes right after this, when he says this: but I think most people are Democrats for the opposite reason. Most people believe in democracy, Lewis is saying, because they don't believe in the fall of man. Most people disbelieve in human sinfulness, and that is why they think everybody should have a hand in government. They reject the doctrine of the fall, and so they have a very optimistic view of government and politics and political power over one another. And for Lewis, this is forgetting that human nature's fallen. And what's the problem with that? Well, for Lewis, this is where this goes. If you forget that human nature is fallen and start thinking about politics, government, and democracy, you come up with what he called, this is his language, he called a sentimental view of democracy. Or, he called it, I have it in the parenthesis, a false romantic view of democracy. And what is that? A sentimental view of democracy, a false romantic view of democracy. It is the belief that we are, these are Lewis's words, you can see it up on the slide, so wise and good that everyone deserves a share in government. And for Lewis, that was silly nonsense. As he says in his essay on equality, I don't deserve a share in governing a hen roost, he says, much less a nation. Nor do most people, Lewis goes on to say, all the people who believe in advertisements and think in catchwords and spread rumors. That is to say, like, who has the competency or the judgment or the temper or the wisdom or the prudence or the self-restraint to be entrusted with political power over other people? That's what he's driving at there. Like, who has the competency or the capacity? Who would presume to do that, is Lewis's point. But even more to the point is this, and this gets right to the nub of the issue for Lewis. Mankind, he says, is so fallen that no man can be trusted with unchecked power over his fellows. And so in our story as a nation, American democracy, the top picture, chattel slavery. Unchecked power by a democracy over fellows. And the bottom picture, the concentration camp in the Second World War that Lewis was very familiar with. And for Lewis, this was the deal: political power. He was deeply skeptical of political power, of our use of and handling of political power. He was not naive about it. He was not naive about political power, nor was he optimistic about the use of political power. I can imagine him and his good friend J.R.R. Tolkien talking about the Lord of the Rings and the significance and the symbolism of the one ring of power as a powerful symbol of political power. And going back and forth and resonating together on just how dangerous political power is given the fall of humanity. And so for Lewis, this is what he says about political power. Check this out. All political power is at best a necessary evil. And this is how he says it in Lilies That Fester, an essay, a brilliant essay, Lilies That Fester, which would be fun to read. I mean, that's another nice metaphor. Medicine and food, not medicine. Democracy is medicine, not food. You could have done Democracy, Lilies That Fester, because this is kind of the punchline of that essay, which is a super powerful punchline there in that essay. But he says this: all political power is at best a necessary evil, but is least evil when its sanctions are most modest and commonplace, when it claims no more than to be useful or convenient and sets itself strictly to limited objectives. In other words, if you're going to handle and use political power, man, exercise and show incredible restraint with it. Because who can be trusted with it? This is Lewis's point. And so you're probably picking up that Lewis is not an optimist, right? He's not the boy with his raincoat on the left-hand side of the picture, or the left-hand side of the picture for you, that is looking at the rain clouds, but it's all going to work out just fine. He's not an optimist. But he's not a dour old pessimist either, like the grumpy old guy, which actually I think is a picture of Arthur Schopenhauer, if that means anything to anyone in the room tonight. He's not a grumpy old man either. He's not a pessimist. Rather, Lewis is what I like to call a moral realist, or what I really like to call a meerkat moral realist. Right, where he's very alert. He comes out of his hole, right? Because he's not a pessimist. He's not just going to get kind of completely eaten by the eagles. But he's not an optimist. He's not strolling around like, look at those lovely talons. He's a moral realist. He's a meerkat moral realist. And in this sense, it puts him in great standing and with a great kind of affinity with this gentleman. You recognize this picture? From our own story as a country? This is a picture of James Madison, one of our founding fathers and the great architect of the American constitutional system. Lewis and Madison, and Washington for that matter, would have been very nicely aligned in their understanding of political power and its dangers and fallen human nature. And so Madison, in the Federalist Papers, probably the finest piece of political philosophy written by any American, and he wasn't the only author, Hamilton and John Jay and Madison, but in the Federalist Papers, in Federalist 51, he says this, which probably, if you haven't read Federalist 51, go Google it up. Probably, for my money, next to the Declaration of Independence, probably the most profound piece of political philosophy written in America, in my opinion. But he says this: what is government but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. And so Madison is saying here, government needs to reflect, that is to say, to be designed to deal with the reality of human nature. If we were angels and not fallen, no need for government. Actually, Lewis would disagree with that, the second point, but we'll stay with the main thing, which is you've got to design a government. You've got to think about the starting point for architecting and approaching government is a sober view of human nature. And so Lewis and our founding fathers, in many ways, certainly Madison in Federalist 51, would have been very much aligned in that. And so you see, for Lewis, democracy is this in a nutshell. Democracy, for Lewis, is this. It is a necessity, not an ideal. It is a political necessity, not a moral or political ideal. It is protecting, fundamentally, protecting human rights, protecting liberty, Lewis would say, not perfecting human nature. It is fundamentally defensive, not constructive. Democracy is not designed to build us into something better. Not in Lewis's conception, not arguably in Madison's conception. Rather, its primary purpose is defensive, to protect and defend us from having our rights taken from us or being harmed. So it's defensive, not constructive. Fourthly, limited, therefore not expansive. And fifthly and finally, it's a means, not an end. It's not the end of human existence, it's a means to get us to the good stuff, to get us to where we want to go. And so the metaphor that Lewis uses is democracy is medicine, not food. Democracy is protective and preventative like medicine, not nourishing and life-giving like food. This is the metaphor that Lewis uses. But how do you think most Americans think about this? My take is that most Americans reverse it entirely. Most Americans, I think democracy is food, not medicine. It is nourishing and life-giving, not merely protective. And so my take is that most Americans, and here obviously Lewis doesn't speak to the American situation, but I'm kind of going to extend a little bit of Lewis and riff for just a second here. For Americans, I think, most Americans think of democracy as an ideal, not a necessity, or not merely a necessity. And I could string lots of quotes together from political philosophers that say just this very thing, that it has become and ought to be viewed as an ideal we ought to all be pursuing rather than a necessity of human nature. And it's perfecting, not merely protecting. And it is constructive, not merely defensive. We're going to achieve something together. We're going to turn all of us into the best version of ourselves. And it's expansive and not limited. Of course, when you think of democracy as an ideal that is perfecting and constructive and doing good things to people, of course, it is super tempting to have it expand and expand and expand and develop more and more and more of our lives, which is exactly what's happened. And fifthly and finally, it is an end, not a means. But not for Lewis. That's not the way Lewis sees it. This from Mere Christianity, I think, is really helpful and really on point. He says this, check this quote out. The state, the government, democracy, exists simply. By the way, we don't use simply in our American political discourse very often, do we? Like, this is just simply. We speak very expansively, very grandiosely, very aggrandizingly. Not, it's just simply this. We don't talk that way, but Lewis talks this way. The state exists simply, and here's this language, to promote and to protect the ordinary happiness of human beings in this life. Ordinary happiness, that's the end. Democracy, merely to protect that possibility. That's the way Lewis sees it. And what is this ordinary happiness of human beings in this life? Lewis, in his Lewisian kind of way, starts waxing eloquent. A husband and a wife chatting over a fire. A couple of friends having a game of darts in a pub. Doesn't that sound fun, a game of darts in a pub? A man reading a book in his own room or digging his own garden. That is what the state is there for. That is its purpose. And unless they are helping to increase or prolong and protect such moments, all the laws, parliaments, armies, courts, police, economics, etc., are simply a waste of time. And so for Lewis, democracy is medicine. It's not food. But you may be wondering, so what? So what? And I have, with Lewis's help, 2 so whats for you to consider as we close tonight. The first is, because democracy is medicine, not food, find food elsewhere. Find food elsewhere. Perhaps I can put it this way. Don't treat medicine as food. It will make you really sick. Don't treat your COVID vaccine as a 4-course meal. The very thing that is meant to protect you from serious problems will become an incredible problem. Could it be that we are all overdoing democracy? Could it be that we are stuffing ourselves with medicine and wondering why we are sick? Could that be? A sick society, says Lewis, must think much about politics, as a sick man must think much about his digestion. And if that's true, we are a sick society indeed. I mean, imagine if Lewis would have lived to see 24-hour news. Like, he got nervous when the London Times showed up at his house. There's this really powerful section in Mere Christianity where Lewis he's talking about sexual chastity and sexual morality. I think in the chapter on marriage, or maybe on the chapter on sexual morality, where he just makes the very powerful and at first blush counterintuitive point that our sexual libertinism is not a sign of virility and health and vitality. It's a sign of deep sickness, sexually. And so then he goes on to say, like, if you were to visit from another planet and see a striptease in a strip club, imagine going in and seeing like a restaurant where they bring out a piece of, this is Lewis's metaphor, bring out a piece of meat on a plate and everybody gawks at it. Your conclusion would be they're all starved. Not they're so full they're just kind of going crazy. And so is 24-hour news our striptease? Are we glutting ourselves, trying to turn medicine into food, trying to find nourishment from that which is not designed to nourish, but to protect? Lewis puts it this way in his essay on membership from 1945. The secular community, that is government, politics, democracy, since it exists for our natural good and not for our supernatural, has no higher end than to facilitate, here's this language again, facilitate and safeguard the end. And what is the end? Family and friendship and solitude. That's the end. Not Fox News and CNN and MSNBC, but family and friendship and solitude. That's what gives life. And so find your food elsewhere. That's the so what, number one. Number two, practice humble politics. I think Lewis would encourage us. Practice humble politics. What does that mean? Practice humble politics. I think it means a couple of things. Again, drawing on Lewis's writing, and I'm not going to quote all of the things where I draw these points from, but here is one of the things you could get from Lewis. Make more modest claims about government. I think if Lewis was here, he'd say, practice the humble politics. And what does that look like? That looks like making more modest claims about government. And what would that sound like? Well, it would sound like probably not talking about the upcoming election as saving American democracy, or better yet, saving America. Like, y'all, isn't it so grandiose the way we talk? Isn't it? Doesn't it strike you as like extremely exaggerated and inflated to the reality? I think practicing a humble politics from Lewis's perspective would be to make more modest claims about the function, the purpose, the capacity, the impact of government. And so to have a more modest view of government. Secondly, I think he might say something like, make more modest claims about this moment that we find ourselves in. As we said at the outset, like, this is a challenging time in America. This is a challenge. But there have been, I haven't lived through a lot of them because I'm young, but there have been a lot of, I read the history books, there's a lot of challenging times in America. Like the Revolutionary period looks to me like a fairly challenging time. King George coming after you, that sounds scary. And the Civil War was a serious time. And Reconstruction and Jim Crow, that was a super serious time. And World War I was a serious time, and the Gilded Age was a serious time, and the Great Depression was a serious time, and the World War II was a serious time, and the 1960s, and Kennedy and King and assassinations in Vietnam. That sounds serious and complicated and heartbreaking and tragic, and the world's about ready to come unglued. And so all this is to say, like, I think for all of us, like, practicing a humble policy, to be modest about what we say, what we expect, what we hope, what we envision, what we imagine from government, and it would be like just to realize we're in a hard time, but there's been lots of hard times, and this might not be a uniquely hard time. It might not be. God knows if it's a uniquely hard time, but it might just be business as usual hard time. Lewis had this marvelous phrase about reading books, and the phrase he used, he said, if you're going to read a new book, you're going to read a recently published book, you're going to go to Barnes & Noble and get like an Amazon, or like a bestseller, go ahead, he said, you go ahead and read that, but you have to read 4 old books to 1 new book. He said, beware of chronological snobbery, where the most recent is the most relevant, the most current is the most cool, the most like just hot off the press is the most profound. Lewis thought that was utter nonsense. It's a kind of chronological snobbery. It's like snobbery because of where you stand in the flow of history. Like, oh, I'm here now and it must be better. But as it relates to politics, there's a kind of chronological snobbery. It's like our moment is the most significant, the most serious, the most dramatic, the most, oh my gosh, of any moment in American history. And I just don't know that that's true. At the very least, I mean, if God showed up and said, Wilson, is true, say, okay, no problem. But at the very least, like, we could exercise some modesty about this particular moment. 2 other final points on this. Make more modest claims about your views. Going to practice humble politics, make more modest claims about your, of course, I mean, political views. Political views. Lewis is really great on this point. He's like, at the end of the day, all political policy, all approaches to government, we're just giving our best guess. That's the way he puts it. We're just giving our best guess. How would American political culture or the political dynamics in the life of the evangelical church be dramatically changed if we exercised a little more intellectual humility about our own political views? Where we started talking like, I see it this way. I could be wrong on this. I'm not, I've been thinking about it. I'd love to hear what you think because I know I don't have the corner on truth. Me and my friends think this, but there's a lot of other people out there that see it differently, even good Christians that see it very differently. What do you think? Like, that is being more modest about your views, your political views. And that's what a humble politics would look like. And then fourthly and finally, make more immodest claims about eternity. Make more immodest claims about eternity. You cannot over-exaggerate the significance of eternity. You can only, check this out, you can only underestimate the significance, the profundity, the power, and the impact of eternity. And so be very immodest in your thinking about that if you are, well, not if you're a follower of Christ, that every human being is living forever in one of two places. Every human being is an eternal creature. It's going to go on forever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever. America's 250 years old. That's a lot older than I am. But it's not older than what I will be. In light of eternity, when we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we'll have no less days to say, like, right? So when we've been there for a long time, we'll look back at America and last for 500 years or whatever, you know, vapor. Vapor. The country we live in, which is magnificent in so many ways, vapor in the light of eternity. And so listen to Lewis on this from Mere Christianity. Check this out. If individuals live only 70 years, which is the way most people view the world in their secular mindset, we got like 70 or 80 years. If individuals live only 70 years, then a state or a nation or a civilization, which may last for 1,000 years, is more important than an individual. Ergo, therefore, individuals submit to that which is more important. This is where collectivism comes from in Lewis's thinking that he is very concerned with, because he's watched fascism and Nazism and communism arise in his own day before his very eyes, where this is the message: submit people, populace, to this much more important thing called the state or the government. He's got the Third Reich in his mind, no doubt. But check this out. If Christianity is true, then the individual is not only more important, but incomparably more important, for he is everlasting, and the life of a state or a civilization compared with his is only a moment. And let me take this, being immodest about eternity and seeing your life vis-a-vis American democracy and government and the state in light of what will be your life all the way into eternity. Let me take this insight and apply it practically and personally, and I hope movingly to you, by quoting from Lewis to close, from what I think is probably his most magnificent piece of writing, which was actually a sermon he preached to university students called The Weight of Glory. It is in light of these overwhelming possibilities. He's talking about how human beings will live forever in one of two places. It is in light of these overwhelming possibilities, Lewis says. It is with the awe and the circumspection proper to them that we should conduct all our dealings with one another, all friendships, all loves, all play, all politics, with awe and circumspection. There are no ordinary people. Donald Trump is not ordinary. Kamala Harris is not ordinary. And none of us in this room are ordinary. Rather, as Lewis says, you have never talked to a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, arts, civilizations, these are mortal. And their life is to ours as the life of a gnat. But it is immortals with whom we joke, work, marry, snub, and exploit. Immortal horrors or everlasting splendors. And so we return to where we began with Lewis's big picture. Medicine, friends, is not food. Democracy is medicine and not food. Lewis on the purpose and the perils of democracy. and an encouragement for each of us to find our food elsewhere because of that, and to practice a humble politics that is very, very immodest about eternity. Amen? Let's pray together. Father, I think of the passage in the book of James where he talks about how our life is a vapor and a mist. That is to say, our earthly life. But our life that is hidden with Christ and in you is a life that will go on forever and ever and ever. And that's an amazing, stunning, incomprehensible thought to all of us, to try to wrap our heads around what that actually means. Lord, I pray that those sorts of truths that we find in Scripture and in the Christian tradition and the Christian faith would be our signposts and our anchors and our guides as we try faithfully to navigate democratic citizenship in this country that we love, in this country that is comprised of tens of millions of people made in the image of God, beautiful and magnificent and fallen, ourselves included. And so may we, as we practice a humble politics, do it with our minds poised on the cross of Christ and the beauty and the virtue of forgiveness and repentance and brokenness. And may we do so with our minds fixed on the resurrection of Jesus and his triumphant power and his promise of ultimate victory and his promise as King of Kings and Lord of Lords to one day make the world, bring the world to rights. We pray you would hasten the day, Lord Jesus. May it come soon. Amen.
All right, thank you. I'm going to give you this seat over here so you can face our crowd. All right, Todd, wonderful, thank you.
Thank you.
It's good to hear you again. It takes me back to your preaching days, so it's wonderful. I'm going to just start with one question. So you all be thinking, and maybe you can come up and kind of queue up a little bit in line, then I'll know we have someone. But I'll give us one question or two if we need to get going. Let's start with this one. Who would C.S. Lewis tell us to vote for?
Oh, gosh. Yeah, I did kind of tee up that you could ask that question, and I didn't really think of what my answer would be to that question. Well, who would C.S. Lewis vote for? You know, that'd be a great question to just go home and like ponder, wouldn't it? I mean, that's a good... Just pray about that.
Let's just all pray about that.
Okay. I think Lewis would just groan at the state of American democracy. I think so. I think like he might get to the answer, but he would be like, ooh. I have a hard time. You know, he has a conservative, I'm going to do a Gerald here.
Okay.
He has a conservative impulse and he has a kind of progressive impulse, right? Ditches. Exactly. He might have, I was about to say he might have been an Enneagram 9, but I think given his conservative instincts, and I would have a hard time envisioning voting for Donald Trump. I also would have a hard time envisioning him voting for the Democratic candidate, for Kamala Harris, because he was so skittish and anxious about the exercise of expansive political power. So I don't know who he would vote for, to be honest. I mean, he might do what I have done in the past, which is write-in candidates.
Yeah. Say more about, so you made the comment that he's, I agree with you. He's very conservative in his kind of outlook of life. And you said that would then, because he's conservative, would prevent him from voting for Donald Trump.
Yeah,
Maybe
well,
explain that, because
yeah,
that might
yeah.
not make sense to...
So what I have in my head is I have a section in Mere Christianity where he talks about, he says, look, if the ideal Christian society could come into existence, it would frustrate all of us. Because there are little bits of it that we don't like and little bits over here that other people don't like. Because Christianity is just that kind of a thing.
Yeah.
Christianity is maddeningly at times, agonizingly tension-filled. And all of us want to release tension to make our lives easier, right? So, is Jesus God? Is Jesus man? I think I'm going to choose one or the other, because living with this incarnation thing is like mad.
Yeah.
Or providence and human responsibility, or creator and creature, like all those like tensions.
Mercy and justice.
Mercy and all those tensions, like tension fraud. If you want a simple and easy emotional life, don't become a Christian. Because it's fraught with those tensions, right? And so he says this about Christian society. If you could enact the full range of biblical teaching in a society, it would like bother all of us. We'd like parts of it, we wouldn't like parts. And so he says, like, the progressive thing, he says, some of you might accuse me of being left-wing, because he's very much a believer in equality. He likes John Stuart Mill's no harm principle, which is sort of a foundational principle of liberal jurisprudence over the last probably 100 years maybe. He believes in economic equality. In fact, he says on a couple of occasions there needs to be more economic equality, so he would probably be much more sympathetic with a very robust welfare state and perhaps redistribution, like a good British. Even Tories, I think, are much more there than conservative Republicans in America. So he would have all that, but then he would say, but on the other hand, he believes in chastity and sexual morality and faithfulness and all of the character issues as well, right? And that's the conservative piece of him. And so I just have a very hard time thinking he could be enthusiastic about or get himself to pull the lever for someone who is of the character and of Donald Trump.
Okay, that's good. Anyone's got a question? I got more questions, so you come on up if you got a question. Here is another question for us. You quoted Madison, who said, if men were angels, there'd be no need for government. And then you said, I don't know that Lewis would agree with there would be no need for government.
Yes.
So I want to tease this out. And, right, so the argument for Lewis made for democracy is sort of our innate sinfulness, and sort of sin sort of checks sin, right? So we check the sin of the king with, by distributing it out. We're all going to kind of equally try to keep ourselves in line.
Power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And as Lewis says in a number of places, theocracy is the worst form of government.
Right. Okay. So why would we need a government if we were all angels, as it were, didn't have sin?
Yeah. Well, I think what Madison's probably drawing on there, I could be wrong on this, and again, I'm not a political philosophy scholar by any means, but I think he's probably drawing on like Rousseau's vision of the primitive state, the state of nature. But Rousseau was an optimist. In fact, Lewis says the sentimental view of democracy, the false romantic view, comes from Rousseau and Hegel and Marx, and their slave philosophy is what he calls it, but it comes from Rousseau. And I think Madison is probably working on that idea of in the state of nature, we wouldn't need a government if we weren't fallen. So I think that's what he's doing, would be my guess. Lewis's view is, and he says this explicitly, that if there had been no fall, and I can't remember what essay he says this in, but if there would have been no fall, what would exist is patriarchal monarchy. That's what would exist. Patriarchal monarchy. Lewis was deeply appreciative of what he called the ceremonial monarchy in Britain. He says, I'm very glad we have the politics of democracy because of equality and because of the checks on power.
But he liked this ceremony and sign of monarchy.
Yeah, and I wish I had it in another version of this, and the other version had 60 slides. Because it had all this juicy stuff, and it was so painful to leave some of the stuff. But what he says about that is he says, I love the ceremonial monarchy because it reminds us that medicine is not food, is literally what he says. It's on this theme. Monarchy is nourishing. Monarchy is reality. In Narnia, there is no democracy. And by the way, if you're a follower of Jesus, you have gone through the wardrobe and you live in Narnia. And as Lewis says in another place, quote, the universe is a constitutional monarchy. So, we should just remind ourselves, reality is, if you're a Christian, reality is we live in a constitutional monarchy. Despite 1776. Of course, we live double, which is like a super interesting thing to think about. Like, we live a double life as Christians. Citizens of a democracy that we're thankful for and serves all these great purposes because of the fall. But the reality, the primary reality, the fundamental reality, the original reality that is going to be the consummate reality is constitutional monarchy. And if there would have been no fall, it would have been patriarchal monarchy. Monarchy is what Lewis says. So,
Okay.
Does that speak to the question?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, I think it does. That's good.
It's kind of unsettling.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is we can conceive of hierarchy as only driven by sin or some sort of like corruption, right? But when God creates the world in Genesis 1, Adam and Eve are given dominion over creation to subdue it and to bring it into its completion. And there's no sin yet in the world, right? But there does need to be a sort of ordering and a subduing and a guiding, right? Even apart from sin. And so I think, I think to conceive of a sort of sinless future in which there no longer is a need for structure or direction, is,
And Lewis thinks that would be a travesty because that would be a march and he wants a dance.
And in dance, someone needs to lead, someone needs to, that's right.
And it doesn't need to be the same person.
Yeah.
But there has to be an initiator and a responder and the beautiful dynamic of a dance. So this is Paralandra, right? That's that unfallen world where there's this marvelous movement and motion and sort of cosmic dance happening.
Yeah, and I think this is fundamentally, what makes Lewis conservative is there is an appreciation for hierarchy and power differentiations and the benign use of power that leads to the flourishing. Whereas in more of a progressive mindset, there's such an awareness of the misuses of this power that it's trying to flatten everything, right? And Lewis, I think with his democracy move, he's recognizing that there is a need to flatten things politically, but that is a sort of response to sin, because the ideal is actually we're not equal to God, and that is the beauty of our relationship with God, and we're not equal to the animals, and that's the beauty of our relationship to the animals.
And can I just say
last thing, and then we're
one of the like getting into Lewis and trying to figure out how he thinks about this, one of the most unsettling, striking, counter-cultural, arresting, whoa, is his vision of hierarchy. Equality for him is a mathematical notion that is, he calls it a legal fiction. It's a political fiction. For him, the entire world is hierarchically structured. And so he says, virtue is hierarchical, ideas are hierarchical, every dimension of life is hierarchical. We need equality, he says. So that essay on equality, we need equality to keep from harming each other. But let's not turn that into reality. That's a legal fiction that's protective for all of us. It's really something.
That's good. All right, question. And you can squeeze the handle on squeeze it, and then you can pull it up. You can lift it up. There we go.
Okay, my question is about Lewis not reading the newspapers. Now, if he doesn't read the newspapers and he believes that government, the purpose of the government is so we can all putter around in our gardens and we can shoot darts at the pub and we can read good books, how is it that he is against Nazism and Adolf Hitler if he doesn't read the newspapers? So he evidently got his news from what? The radio? Or he just didn't know about Hitler until he started
Like you
bombing
didn't know about
everybody.
Elizabeth Taylor, right? Yeah, great question. So let me just make sure I understand the question. Is it how was he politically, like how did he get politically informed if he didn't read newspapers?
Yeah, I mean, how could he be against Nazism if he doesn't read the newspaper?
Yeah.
If he doesn't know what's going on in Europe?
Yes.
I mean, I would think he would be like a Neville Chamberlain.
Yeah.
Peace in our
Yes.
times, everything is
Yes.
wonderful.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question, and I have to confess I don't probably know enough about all the details of his life to know how he did pick. I do know that he got together with his friends at the pub, maybe throwing darts, talking about issues in the world
Right.
a lot.
The Inklings.
But I think the thing about newspapers, because what biographers do say about Lewis is that he was quite informed, actually. He was quite informed. But he was sort of famous for poo-pooing newspapers. And I think it was largely because he was so passionate and interested in the perennial and the permanent, not the partisan, not the ephemeral, not the frothy. And so he would look at a newspaper and he would just be like, "Meh." Not that he wasn't informed about the big issues of the day, because he clearly was. In fact, he wrote a lot of the essays that I'm quoted from are in periodicals, news periodicals, magazines at the time. So he stayed current with what the substantive issues were, but he did have an aversion to gobbling up newspapers. Like we might say something like, I don't do social media. And if Lewis is alive today, he'd say, I don't get near social media. Well, how do you know if you're not on Twitter? Well, I have a way of finding out, but it's not through Twitter. That might be something he would say.
Okay.
Oh yeah, let's go over this way.
Hi. Thanks so much.
If you squeeze these handles, the thick
Yeah,
part,
so I'm full.
there we go.
I didn't
There
trust
we go.
myself. Okay.
There it is, yeah.
So my question is about the characterization of Lewis's preference for maybe small government, protective
Yeah.
government, not constructive, right? And
Yes.
I majored in political science, and I can imagine I had a couple Christian professors, and I
Yes.
can imagine them saying to me something along the lines of how much good
Yeah.
politics and government has done over the course of human history. And I think, I'm guessing the main point here is that it's maybe earthly constructive, not spiritually constructive. It's
Yeah.
not where we look for our salvation.
Yeah.
This idea that it's fleeting and we're immortal, I think that would be a compelling response to my professors. But at the same time, when you mention Lewis's preference for robust welfare, for example,
Yeah.
that feels constructive to me. It's
Yeah.
but earthly constructive. So in that sense, maybe
Yes.
it's seductive as like a salvation kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I'm just wondering if you
Yeah,
could
it's
clarify.
such a great question, and I feel the tension that you're putting your finger on. So that's fantastic, and I don't know that I'm going to have a great answer to the tension. It's super good. I would think his view of the welfare issue is a little more protective. It's not constructive; it's protective in his mind. What he was, and in the 63 slide version of this, I had this whole thing on what the peril was, like the kind of riffing on the peril. And for Lewis, the big scary thing was a change in the way we think about government's relationship to people. And from government as protecting and limited to government as he puts it, doing things to people, making them into something. And so he talks about planned scientific democracy is his phrase, that he was super anxious about. This is what abolition of man is largely about. I'm sure you're aware of abolition of man. Like, he's super nervous about that. That's what I'm trying to get at with the constructive bit. When you view government as changing people, like there's problems with people in America, well, we'll use government to change them, right? And where that whole thing comes from is a modern way of thinking about government that pulls out fixed and fallen human nature. So for Lewis, human nature is absolutely the starting point, as was for Madison, I think. Human nature, I emphasize the fallen piece, but the other thing to emphasize is the fixed piece. Right? That's not Rousseauian, as I'm sure you're aware. That's not Rousseauian. If you have a Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, right? Like hugely influential on Western political philosophy and government, and increasingly influential in America. You might say sort of well, I'm starting to digress on that. A Rousseauian view that people are not born with a particular human nature, and if we don't like what they're doing, we can use government to change their fundamental nature. They're plastine, is the way Lewis would say it. They're plastic. And Lewis was like, oh, yeah, that's making me. And so the phrase he uses in Abolition of Man, you're aware of, the man molders of a new age is the way he puts it. He's super worried about the man molders of a new age. And what are the man molders of a new age? The man molders of the new age are the techno-elite government bureaucrats, for Lewis, which is unbelievably prescient, writing this in the 40s. Imagine if he was alive today. One of my slides was who are the man molders of the new age? And I very cheekily had 3 pictures. Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, and Jeff Bezos. And the enormous power they have. So Lewis was super anxious about technological, scientific power and government power getting together to help people and change them and fix them. That's what I mean by constructive, and he was super anxious about it. He's like, no, rein that thing way in. Let it just be an umpire sort of calling balls and strikes. That's the purpose of government. If you give it any more power than that, it's going to tyrannize people. Because scientific planned democracy for Lewis ends in tyranny. It ends in Nazism. That was what Lewis thought. Does that help?
Yeah, a corner store, not a church.
And what? I'm sorry?
A corner store, not a church.
Yes.
OT.
Yes, I just wanted to say that thank you very much, Pastor Todd, for the wonderful presentation. I think the thing is that the understanding that democracy started with the Greeks is wrong, actually, because we practiced democracy before the white man came to our environment. Our own pattern of democracy was different. Unfortunately, it was destroyed when they came, and they now instituted their own type of democracy. And that is what...
OT, could I invite you just to step a little closer to the mic so I can, because I don't know that I'm tracking everything you're saying. I'm really
Yeah, I don't speak loud because my ears are too big.
Okay.
Yeah, I said, people think democracy was started by the Greeks, but that's wrong. Unfortunately, in Africa, we did not have the belief that we should write things. We never wrote things because we believe if you write things, it could be bastardized. So that's why we didn't have any documentation of our own form of government. Yeah. But when the white man came, we had democracy, which they destroyed because they didn't understand it. And that's the problem. Democracy has never been an end in itself. If you think it is an end, then you make a mistake. What I wanted to find out is what C.S. Lewis thinks about the independence.
What C.S. Lewis thinks about independence?
Yes.
You mean independence of African nations from British colonial?
No. Independent voters here.
Independent what?
Voters.
Oh, independent voters, non-politically affiliated voters. Oh. What would he think about that? I don't know.
You're the professional.
I do not know what. Well, no. I think you would say. I think you probably would say, "Good for you," is what he would probably say. I think he'd probably say something like that.
Yeah, because he in your slide you point out earlier, like he's leery of affiliating with a particular party.
Yes, I mean, yes, thank you. Because I mean, if you're to say, "Hey, I'm a Christian. I like some stuff the Republicans do because I've got conservative instincts, and I think you need to have conservative instincts if you believe in fallen human nature and fixed human nature. And I've got some Democrat instincts because I believe in equality and mercy, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'm kind of at no man's land in our current two-party system. I would imagine he would say, good for you. you're living the tension of the Christian faith. That, I would imagine you say that.
We're going to do Esther, and
Thanks.
then Levitt will get you next, okay?
And I never speak quietly, I think you know. It's very interesting because this afternoon I was reading in Harper's a many page article about trying to decentralize power as it was intended in the Constitution.
Yes.
All the checks, the balances and stuff, and what particularly technology
Yes.
is doing to that. Then I turned on 60 Minutes, and they held a whole segment on trying to destroy the monopolies. So that's certainly pertinent right now. Yes. Also, I would like to say, I don't know who wrote it. One of the defenses of democracy is that we're all so terrible that if you put us together, we'll cancel each other out. So it's not that we're all so good.
Well,
it's that
and
Sin checks sin.
I appreciate
Yeah.
it. I mean, in our constitutional architecture, that's called checks and balances and federalism. Right?
Yes.
And in the Federalist Papers and the Founding Fathers, Madison thought, I think it's Federalist 10, not 51, I think it's Federalist 10, he talks about factions, and factions are going to be a
Yes.
problem, he says. But here's the good news. Factions will so battle with each other,
That's right.
none of them can take over the government. What the Founding Fathers did not anticipate, a two-party system.
Yes.
They
Right.
thought there would be lots of factions
Right.
constantly frothing and battling
Yeah.
so that not one of them ever kind of laid hold of the thing and could do stuff with it. That was their view.
There is a line from West Side Story, G. Officer Krumke, which my husband took as his good theological basis, which is, the best of us is no damn good.
All right, we got one last question here, and then Greg. Let Greg in. Levitt.
Hey, thank you for listening. I was gonna write it down, but I don't have it that clear yet, so excuse me if it's not a clear question. I'm gonna try to make it as simple as I can. So in today's sermon, Pastor Gerald said that in Jesus' time, political involvement or influence was not really a thing as compared to today. Like today, we can vote for our leaders, but in Jesus' day, you were totally submissive to your leaders. I was paying attention, Gerald, to your sermon today.
Well done. Unless you're about to critique me, and then it's not well done. Yeah, right. No, keep going.
Yeah, with that being said, so the one thing that fascinates me is that Jesus did come 2,000 years ago. But I was just in this hypothetical scenario, I would imagine what if Jesus didn't come 2,000 years ago and instead came today in 2024? My question would be, do you think Jesus would vote in the national election? Because me personally, I struggle with voting. I don't. So that could be, a topic for another day. But if Jesus was here, would he put in? Now would he vote Republican or Democrat? Would he do it?
Would he vote at all?
Yeah.
Yes. So that's such a great. It's a great question, isn't it? It's a great question. Would Jesus vote? What would Jesus do? WWJD. On this issue, I'm tempted to quote. No, I'm not tempted. I'm going to quote. When they came and asked him, should we pay taxes to Caesar?
That's what I was going to say. That's good, yeah.
And Jesus, we talked about tensions earlier, and if you want a simple emotional life, don't be a Christian. And don't listen to Jesus and read the Gospels, because he is constantly creating tensions. So he says to the question, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's. And he said that with a twinkle in his eye. Didn't he say that with a pastoral twinkle in his eye? Knowing that they'd be like, ooh, that's good. We're not sure what that means. We're not sure how to do that, but that's really good stuff. Better not put that under a bushel, Jesus, right? So I think he would say to you, if you ask, hey, Jesus, Lord, Master, should I vote? I think he would say to you, without telling you what to do, brother, I think he would say, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's.
That's good.
Greg, finish us out here. This is it. No, Mark, are you trying to jockey? Okay, Mark's the last one.
Mine is kind of the same question, but about Lewis.
Yeah.
But with a little context, right? Like Lewis and Tolkien famously have their letters about for those like Lewis famously or infamously kind of has that passage where he says, maybe we should just let the government have government marriage and the church should do church marriages.
Yes.
And Tolkien's like, that's messed up, brother.
Yes.
He's like, God made humans run gasoline, and a non-Christian marriage is like putting rocks in your engine instead of gasoline.
Yes.
And they're very benignly writing about like heterosexual monogamous state versus religious marriage.
Yes.
And now fast forward 70 years, there's a lot more probably things that they in their genius saw coming, but that are actually here now.
Yes.
And so how do you think that kind of debate plays out between Tolkien and Lewis in 2024? Because honestly, that's the question I think on Levin's heart, on all of our hearts, like the kind of the single issue or multiple issue voting. Lewis kind of, in his writings, left us a little empty-handed in that regard, and Tolkien was more straightforward. But yeah, so do you think like these issues would be so pressing that even he would
Such
say
a great
like,
question.
I have to vote, I have to fight, I have to engage in some way? Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, Greg. Thank you for that. And you mentioned Lewis and Tolkien and their disagreement on marriage, and it actually.
Can you say that again?
Lewis
Maybe I didn't hear it. But
Lewis and Tolkien had a disagreement on marriage, and it was born out of Lewis's own story, because he did a civil marriage to Joy Davidman that was not marriage. He did it as a charity to her, but he did not view it as a marriage, even though they were married in the eyes of the state. And Tolkien found that really bad. And it was a significant sort of strain in their relationship. But as you quoted from Mere Christianity, he talks about how you need to keep Christian marriage and civil marriage strictly separate, he says. Now, and Tolkien, that is not Tolkien's view. And that's not the Catholic tradition's view. And Tolkien is a Catholic, Lewis is a Protestant. In many ways, this, I think, Greg, gets chalked up to the difference between Protestants and Catholics on this question, at least as it relates with marriage. And as it relates with the Catholic transformationist vision and Christendom vision, that there's more of a kind of coterminous, right? Like overlapping, not a loose Venn diagram like a Protestant might have, but like a much more overlap between Christian values and a Christian vision for government and society. Like if you're a Catholic, kind of traditional classic Catholic, that Tolkien's then representing there. And Lewis allows more space, you might say, for that. Lewis is surprisingly sympathetic with John Stuart. I mean, I mentioned it, but it kind of fast and passing. He's a John Lockean classical liberal, which is like this limited government stuff. He's not a Pelagian theologically, like John Locke. He's more of an Augustinian, right, or a much more robust view of fallen human nature. But he's a Lockean. But he also brings on board John Stuart Mill's harm principle, which is fascinating. And he uses that in places to navigate some of these social political problems. For example, homosexuality. He had a view on homosexuality, and his closest friend, his first friend, his second friend, Owen Barfield, his first friend, Arthur Greaves, who was a homosexual. And in fact, I think people think, really was hoping Lewis would have been gay as well, because they became friends very young. And so Lewis was very close to Arthur Greaves and writes to Arthur and talking about, and you get the impression like, he doesn't say it explicitly, but you get the impression that the government should stay out of the business in terms of civil government, ought to stay out of the business of marriage, whether same-sex or heterosexual. That's hard for me personally. I have more of a Catholic view on that. Or have, anyways. I mean, Lewis has been challenging my thinking on that significantly. But does that speak to your question? It's an ongoing issue, for sure. I mean, the tension you see between Lewis and Tolkien, we're still working out as a church, it seems to me, that same tension.
Mark, come on up and ask your question, and then we'll be done.
This is a little bit of a tangent, but I'm just fascinated I realized that Lewis lived in the era of Churchill. And Churchill's personality was polar opposite to C.S. Lewis. So, and yet Churchill was, on the political front, was brilliant at bringing Britain together.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, did Lewis ever write anything about Churchill or his accomplishments, commend him? They obviously had some views that were the same, like the monarchy and the Christianity being the foundation of civilized society. But I'm just wondering if he wrote anything about that.
I haven't come across, again, I haven't, there's 3 volumes of all of Lewis's letters that's several thousand pages, and I must confess I have not read that from start to finish. Right, I've read bits of it, and there may be something in there where he talks about Churchill. I don't know. He did get from Churchill what is it called, Mark? You may know it's like the highest. It's like the Medal of Honor in America, whatever that is in Britain.
The knighthood.
That it wasn't. It was something royal, something fancy, and he declined it.
Oh.
Maybe that's what it is. What does it say it again? Maybe that's what it was. But some serious honor that Churchill gave to him because he was the voice, the kind of moral and religious voice during the Second World War, and that was such a big deal with his Mere Christianity talks. Maybe the most famous person, well, one of the most famous people during the Second World War in Britain because of the Mere Christianity. And so he was honored with this super fancy honor, and he turned it down because he didn't want all of his readers and all of his followers to think he had a political allegiance.
Oh, interesting. I didn't realize that.
So that's a little connection. Other people think, I haven't read this, I've gotten into this, but a C.S. Lewis person has argued that he actually served as a British spy during the Second World War. I don't know the evidence or the deal on that, but anyways, it's interesting. I don't know if he says much about Churchill, but he did have that interaction and wrote a letter back, a very kind of cordial, deferential, I can't receive this kind honor for these reasons, to Churchill.
And Churchill accepted it?
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
Todd, thank you for everything
Yeah.
this evening. Let's give Todd a round of applause. All right, well, we're done for tonight, and you can come up and assault Todd with more questions if you want to stick around for a little bit. But thank you for coming this evening.